What is a hero? A mythological figure, often of divine descent, endowed with great strength or ability? An illustrious warrior? No. It's a person admired for achievements and noble qualities, one who shows great courage. Welcome to the What's a Hero podcast, where we dive deep into what a hero is and what makes them that hero. I'm your host, Ken Frownfelter, and I'm going to be introducing you to some of the world's most likely and unlikely heroes. You may have never heard of them before, and they most likely have never met you. But they all have one thing in common. They are ready to do whatever it takes to help make you better, even if it means sacrificing everything for you. Let's get into it.
This is episode 38 of the What's a Hero podcast with me, Ken Frownfelter. Over the course of 2 years, a police officer turned first-time filmmaker and his wife traveled the United States and brought together experts and current and former law enforcement officers in an effort to explore the highly secretive and often misunderstood and socially taboo topic of what the officer experiences in the wake of an officer-involved shooting. And what they found was profound, and the statement was on the sheer humanity of the men and women who make these split-second decisions and then enter into an emotionally charged series of events and questions. And this is, that 2 years was culminated into a documentary by Patrick W. Shaver, and that documentary is called Officer Involved, a look, if only a glimpse, of what it means to be an officer involved. Now, I don't have Patrick Shaver with us today, but I do have two people who are showcased in that video, in that movie, in that documentary. And those people have been so gracious enough to come on today. And not only are they able to talk about that whole issue involving the whole officer-involved shooting and everything else, but the life that surrounds everything about that. And so what I want to do today is welcome Kathy and Javier Bustos to the What's a Hero podcast. Welcome, you guys.
Thank you, Ken. We're happy to be here.
Yes, thank you, Ken. We are really happy that you've asked us to be on this podcast.
Absolutely. I'm very honored to have you guys on here. I think it's cool that you guys are able to make some time, because this is kind of a tough topic that a lot of people don't, really see the other side of. They think that it's just one of those things, especially with the media now. Everybody looks at it as, oh, the cops are just shooting everybody and that's just how it is. And then they go home and they have birthday parties and they drink a beer and they do whatever, and that's not what it is. There's a lot of baggage that comes with stuff like that. And how do we not only survive with ourselves, but how do we survive with our families, and how do we survive relationships and stuff when we're sometimes doubting ourselves? Did I do the right thing? Did I do good? And you guys are testaments to the struggle's real, but it's worth it, I would assume, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree. And I like what you said about as far as the media and an officer-involved shooting, because sometimes everybody else in an officer-involved shooting is portrayed as human, except for the officer themselves that
right.
actually pulled the trigger.
Right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people and, the citizens, civilians, and the media think that if an officer is involved in an officer-involved shooting, it's only the officer that is affected, and that they think that's the worst thing that can happen. But,
right.
As we all know in law enforcement profession, an officer-involved shooting is just one of many critical incidents that you can be involved with as a law enforcement officer.
Right. And something that people forget, too, is when a critical incident happens to the officer, it happens to the whole family for that officer. They all go through something during that traumatic incident.
Right, right. So you guys are both current and former police officers, correct?
Yes, I'm retired after 25 years, and Javier's still active duty. Right.
And where did that come from? I'd like to figure out who you guys are. Where'd you guys come from with that? So who were you guys growing up? What'd you do, and what kind of molded you into the people that you are today?
Kathy?
I always envy the people who grew up knowing that they wanted to be a police officer, because I was not that person.
Yeah.
I was about 29 years old when I decided that I wanted to become a police officer. And it's because I like to say in a previous life, I was a family violence survivor, and I wanted to do better for other family violence survivors in going forward. And the way to do that is through law enforcement. I felt like I could do a better job than the police officers that dealt with me going through that. And so that's why I became a police officer. But it was pretty late in life. I was not one of those that grew up saying, I want to be a police officer growing up all my life.
Right. What about you, Javier?
Well, after I found out pretty quick that I didn't have the math or science, the aptitude to be an astronaut,
sure,
and I didn't have the money to be Batman, I grew up watching a lot of cop shows in the 70s and 80s, like a lot of kids did.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things where the good guys were there to protect and serve and help the victims. I experienced family violence also myself through a family member who was a victim. So I got to see that side of it where I saw my sister be a victim of violence and how it affected my whole family to include me. So as I grew up, with the exposure of all the cop shows and Batman's philosophy of righting wrongs, it was simple for me to fall into a law enforcement mindset. And when I went into the Air Force, the career field that I chose was what was then called security police, which was basically law enforcement. And that's what began my journey as far as pinning on the badge and protecting and serving. So when I left the Air Force, it was a transition of going to civilian law enforcement, which I ended up doing.
That's just the way it goes. So when you guys were growing up, were you outside playing all the time? And I mean, yeah, you said you watched cop shows, but I'm assuming when those weren't on, you were outside riding bikes and playing and getting in trouble, playing ball. And
oh yeah, Javier was an athlete. I was not an athlete. I was more of a rebel. But I spent much of my time was outside, digging in the dirt and climbing hills and playing in the playgrounds and things like that with the kids. I grew up in apartment complexes or hotels because my dad managed hotels growing up. And so I always had a lot of people around me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I noticed. Oh, go ahead.
What I was going to say was, I think every kid in the 70s and the 80s to a certain point, it was just natural to play outside. We didn't have the electronics that you have now that keep you inside connected in that manner. So our connections were actual real world connections physically with other people. And that's how we grew up.
Right. And, and that's the reason I asked this, because I talked to a lot of folks on here, and one of the things, the common themes is they played outside. They did stuff outside. They weren't just, even the kids I have people that they did band or they did, whatever. But they still played. They still were rough. They were still a little bit more, outdoorsy, and they did things instead of just letting things happen. They made things happen. And I think, and it's almost like it's a common theme that people that become police officers or first responders or heroes, that they do stuff to make things happen as opposed to let things happen to them. And that's kind of just a common theme that I like to ask and get out of the way. But I think it's cool that it's almost, at this point, it's almost 100% of the people I talk to that has that thing.
Yeah, you're right about that. I have found there's a common denominator between people who go into law enforcement or first responder, any profession, have typically been through some pretty traumatic things already. And they go into this profession to be able to help other people not endure the things that they endured. Right.
I agree with you. I'm looking back on all the folks I've had on the podcast, and it's almost 100%. So that's actually really cool. And I've had teachers and I've had nurses on here, and that you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, first responder, but and they may not be. However, they're still heroes, and they still serve other people, and they still, but that mindset is there where I got to do something for somebody else. It's and it's absolutely, it's really important, and that's cool. So you guys obviously you go through school and everything. And so you knew this is what you wanted to do. You knew you wanted to be a police officer, Javi. But Kathy, you were at that point where you're just, I'm not sure what I was going to do after school. Is that what?
Well,
right?
I did not attend college after high school. I kind of worked odd jobs and worked mainly apartment management. In the course, I had 2 children, and just always knew that I had a calling to be something more than an apartment manager or, a convenience store clerk. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just always felt like there was a calling that was not fulfilled.
Right.
And I was sitting at a birthday party with my cousin one day, who was a police officer in a different state. And I was telling her, how much I loved being around police officers and talking to them. And she said, "Why don't you become a cop?" And of course I stopped because she caught me off guard. And in my head, I was thinking of all the reasons why I shouldn't do it.
Right.
I've got small children that, it's working nights and weekends and all the things. And then it just stuck with me. Why don't I become a police officer? And I started the Reserve Police Academy in like 1993, and then ultimately got hired at a police department in near Fort Hood, Texas. And the rest is history, basically. But it was just that one question that she asked me that kind of, shocked me into, that's absolutely what I'm going to be doing.
Right, right. And Javier, you knew that this is what you wanted to do. And so
Yes.
Obviously you couldn't do it at 18 right away. So you decided, hey, I got to go in the military first.
Right. And my path to the military wasn't as common as your 18-year-old going in. I actually went to college and graduated with a bachelor's degree in communications, but a little thing called Desert Shield and then Desert Storm happened.
Uh-huh.
And it was after that I decided that I wanted something more than what I had gone to school for. And I was basically in the mindset, my family's had it great in this country, and I'm going to pay it back by joining the military. And so I went to the Air Force and became a cop. So that was my decision to do at 23, going into the age of 24.
Right. And so did you do 4 years there?
I did 8 years active
years.
duty,
Nice.
and then so many more years as a reservist. And ultimately, I decided that my duties as a police officer, civilian side, were much more demanding than what I was doing as a reservist. Mm-hmm. So I made the conscious decision that I was going to leave the reserves and concentrate on my career with the police department.
Nice. And so you were in the Air Force for 8 years, and you got out knowing with a job, or did you say, I got to go find one?
Well, basically, when I left the Air Force, I knew I wanted to go in law enforcement, and I went home to San Antonio, Texas. And my goal was I was just going to apply for SAPD and be a hometown cop.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend of mine who worked in the Austin, Texas area, and he said, Austin is hiring too. Why don't you go ahead and apply? And I said, why not? Why not go through two processes at the same time?
Yeah.
And I did that. And what happened was the recruiting efforts from the Austin Police Department was way better than what I was experiencing in San Antonio. They actually made me feel, one, like a human being, and two, like they really wanted me to come work for them.
Oh, yeah.
And that really impressed me. So ultimately, the goal was I wanted to be a police officer, and the idea of being a hometown cop really left me because of how I got treated by the recruiting division.
Right. And that is cool, because the bottom line is you want to go where you're wanted. I mean, yeah, everybody knows where they're needed, and that's cool. If I'm needed, we're all needed. But I think the wanted makes the difference, and that's where you want to stay. You want to put in.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I don't regret that decision, because on my mom's side of the family, it's humongous, and I would have hated the fact of arresting a cousin.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So you start there, and you guys. Now you didn't say Austin, did you, Kathy?
No, I retired from Cedar Park. I originally worked in a town in Texas called Copper's Cove. And when Javier and I met, one of us had to make a big life change because of the proximity. We were about an hour and a half away from each other.
Yep.
And of course, I always like to say that I work and he made the money. So it was only logical that I would move because his job was very, very lucrative as an officer for Austin versus mine for a smaller city.
Mm-hmm.
And so I moved closer and ended up retiring from Cedar Park Police Department, which borders Austin on the north side.
Oh, okay. And so I guess, and you said you did 25 years there.
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
Yes.
Wow. So you guys have not been, I guess, you guys have been together for a short time
We've been together for 20 years,
Right.
Married for 18. He tells me these things. But, yeah, we've been married for 18. We've been together for 20 years. We met actually online before it was trendy.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
So, in a police chat room, oddly enough. But we've been together 2 years into his career, and I was seven or
six
or seven into mine.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's cool. That's very cool. And so you guys are doing that. You're obviously at this point, then before you've met each other, you guys are working the streets. You guys are going through the rookie stuff and everything that it entails, and learning the job and how to become what you are. And you guys find that was just the easiest thing in the world to do, and that's just what you were made to do. And why doesn't everybody do this? Or not so much?
I know I did. I absolutely did. I ate, drank, and slept law enforcement. I stayed on the road for 12 years. I didn't want to leave the road because I loved it. In both my departments. And I did SWAT, I did field training officer, everything that you could do within the law enforcement profession. I did it. Negotiator. And I loved it. I still love it, and didn't leave bitter or anything. I left very happy and healthy. But yeah, I ate it up for the entire 25 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was the same way too. As a young officer, it was run and gun, catch the bad guy, get in the foot chases, the vehicle pursuits and whatnot, which I think most young officers back then experienced and felt. They pinned on the badge, and they had all this new authority, and they went out there because they wanted to fight crime and do good. So yeah, I experienced the same thing too, where it was all about patrol, and it's always been about patrol for me, because even though I promoted up to the rank of corporal, I never left patrol, which I've always been very proud to say that when I retire as a patrol officer.
Yeah, a lot of people don't, you don't hear a lot of people say that. They say that, they moved up the ranks to, sergeant, lieutenant, whatever. But if your whole idea, your whole thing is, this is what I do, and I do patrol, and then why not? I mean, it's not just necessarily a young man's game. It's not like, woodland firefighting or something like that. That has to be a young man's game. But, patrol, it takes some brains, and it takes a lot of experience to be able to know exactly what the next step is and what you're going to do and all that.
Oh, we agree. Yeah. Wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
We think it's funny now that officers, now being on patrol for a lengthy period of time back in the day was a badge of honor. Well, I've been on patrol, 23 years or however many years, and that was something you were proud of. But now, after a couple of years, everybody's like, oh, I got to get off patrol. I need to do something specialized.
Right.
Yeah, the millennial.
There's nothing more specialized than having to come up with a different response to whatever call you take during the day.
Right. Everything's different all the time. There's no known either. They talk about routine or whatever. Well, there's no routine. We have routines that we're supposed to follow based off of our training or whatever, but there's no routine to say you have to do this, and this is going to be the same traffic stop or the same domestic violence call or the same, whatever. And so, yeah, there's a lot of moving parts that you have to really train.
And I think it's also important that you spend those years on patrol, because if people honestly think about their careers when they did patrol, if you think about when you're a patrol officer, say at 2.5 years, and then let's say you think about yourself as a patrol officer at 6.5 or 8 or 9 or 10 years, you're still a patrol officer, but you do things differently, and your approach is differently because you've learned so much and you have that vast experience. And I feel that, unfortunately, that's what's being lost with the new generation of officers, is that they want to get off patrol so fast that they're losing the opportunity of getting more and more experiences in. I understand it. You might take the same calls over and over again throughout your career. I get that. But as you grow as a person, as you mature as a person, and as a law enforcement officer, you start to see a bigger picture and how you can approach things.
Yeah.
And that's, I feel, part of the lost art of patrol, because then you have people with sometimes minimal patrol experience and they promote up. And then they have to make decisions about patrol and patrol officers based on their minimal amount of experience on the streets.
Right. And I think we sometimes just forget that. And, it's a lot like a relationship, and we can get into this as we progress here, but you were talking about you have to just adjust the way that you're going to respond to something, and you have to think about the differences because you're dealing with different people, but you might be dealing with the same people. Who knows? However, they've changed a little bit, or the circumstances have changed. And so, like I said, it's a relationship. If like you guys look at you guys as a married couple, if you decided to respond to her the way you would have responded 18 years ago, it's a totally different world. She'd be like, "Who's this guy?"
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yes.
True. Yeah, you nailed it.
I'm like, I've trained you better than that.
That's right.
Right. I didn't realize that when I got married, I was marrying an FTO for life.
That's right. Yeah. Still get your daily observation reports. And she said, look, you're deficient here. We need you to step this up a little bit. The dishes weren't loaded the right way or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So, tell me a little bit about this movie here that you guys, that I've got in my hands. It's the documentary Officer Involved. And what exactly, how did that come about? What is this thing?
Well, basically how it started was, of course, the prerequisite, unfortunately, to be in a documentary like Officer Involved is having to be involved in a shooting, which I was September 25th, 2010. And Kathy at the time at her department was the training sergeant. So she immediately had me, as soon as it was possible, in front of her officers, explaining my experience of being in a shooting, how I felt, how it affected me and whatnot. And through that, I just noticed that when I was speaking to the officers, Kathy was off on the side, interjecting really good points. So I told her, I said, I think you need to be in front of me, not in front of me, but beside me when I do this. And I think that not only should the officer be there at this training, their spouses or their significant others should be there with them, because they're going to be affected too. So that's how it began. And Patrick Shaver contacted us and said, hey, I'm doing this documentary. It's about officer involved shootings. And I've seen y'all on the internet. Would you consent to an interview, the both of you, for this documentary? So I talked to Kathy about it, and we felt that we had a pretty strong message to deliver and hopefully help other people. So we agreed to it. And Patrick was basically on a trek across the country from Atlanta, Georgia at the time, making his stops with his wife, Carla, doing these interviews. So he drove into Austin and we met with them. And they set up their equipment and we did an interview for the day and spent the day with them. And it's cliche-ish, but the rest is history. He liked what we had to say on film and or digital video, as you will. And we were fortunate that he included our interviews and portions of my officer involved shooting in the documentary.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool that you did that. Now, if you wouldn't mind, would you like to go back in time with us to 2010 and tell us how that happened? What is that? What was that whole?
Sure. Wait, you had something to say, Kathy?
2010 was just a nightmare for us.
Oh, right? Yeah. We hate that year.
We hate that year.
Yeah, we hate that year. But basically, I was already a corporal working a night shift in East Austin. And at the time, Kathy was attending a leadership command college, and it was in Huntsville, Texas. So I was getting ready for my night shift, and she came home unexpectedly because she says she had a feeling. She had a feeling she needed to come home. So I got to see her before I went to work, and the night progressed normally until this call dropped that there was a boyfriend basically holding his girlfriend hostage in their home. And he had a gun and shots were being fired. So we went over there to the call. It was what we call the hot shot call, running code 3 with lights and sirens. We got there and we encountered him and his girlfriend in the front yard. It went back quickly. He wouldn't comply. And ultimately, he was able to go back inside his house and get in her BMW in the garage, which the door was closed. So when the garage door opened, we were expecting he was going to run out, shooting at us. We hear the engine of a BMW revving up and he sped off, which ended up turning into a pursuit. I wasn't involved in the pursuit at the time. I stayed on scene because I told the other officers we have to clear the house. We don't know what else is in there.
Right.
We did that. So I thought my involvement for this event was going to be managing a crime scene as a supervisor with officers.
Right.
A big mistake that I made was when I was walking back to my patrol vehicle, I called Kathy on the phone to tell her about what was going on, which if all of you are listening out there, never call your spouse during the middle of a critical incident. Disclaimer.
That's right.
But I called her not realizing that the suspect was speeding back to the scene. And I'm on the phone with Kathy. And next thing I know, he's right behind me doing a donut, just feet away from me.
Wow.
Yeah. So the last thing Kathy hears on the telephone was, "Oh, shoot, I got to go." And I hung up and ran to my patrol vehicle and got involved in the pursuit. The pursuit went through the whole city of Austin. And ultimately, it ended up with him stopping on a roadway, tried to negotiate with him on the PA system. It didn't work. He got back in the vehicle. And when he encountered a vehicle that made it through the perimeter of two gentlemen in a truck, he got out of the vehicle and he was pointing his gun at the two gentlemen in the truck. Either he was going to kill them and take the truck, or he was going to kidnap them and take the truck. But that's when I was forced to have to take a shot, which he went down. Not knowing at the time, after I shot him and he went down, he ended up dying by suicide. He shot himself with his own gun.
Oh.
So that's basically the short and long of the story. And of course, after the fact, I again had to call Kathy and let her know that I was involved in the shooting.
Right. Right. And how was that the first phone call, Kathy, and then the second phone call? How was
this? It's kind of, for me, it's funny because I talk about my two personalities.
Mm-hmm.
As a wife and as a cop, I was really angry at him for texting me or calling me in the middle of an incident.
Mm-hmm.
And I in rational thought, I understand why, because I was a negotiator and he wanted to ask me, if we have to encounter this guy, what should I do? And so I get it, but I was mad when he said, "Oh, shoot, I got to go," and hung up. I was mad. And I texted him and I said, "Don't ever do that again."
Right.
And of course, then the wife in me takes over and I'm like, what if that's my last text message to him?
Right.
So then I text message him, "I love you," to try and make up for being angry. But it was a couple of hours before I got to hear from him again. And what Javier didn't mention is that 1 month prior, I lost an officer in my department to a motorcycle accident. So we had a line of duty death in my department. So we were just kind of just getting our feet back on the ground when he was involved in his shooting. So that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for us. But it was in many ways, it was a very surreal experience because I was reacting as a wife and as a cop.
Mm-hmm.
And those roles kind of were, contradicting each other at times, because as the cop, you're taught, you just get through it. You go on to the next call or the next day or the next everything.
Right.
But as a spouse, I was not being a very good spouse at the time because I was acting as a cop and not as a spouse.
Right. Right.
So it was a conflicting roles.
Right. And when you got the second phone call?
When I got the second phone call, of course, I'm hysterical by then because it had been so long and I hadn't heard anything. And he said, I had to take the shot. I can't talk right now. And I was hysterical. And then he put an officer on the phone and the officer goes, "Sergeant Bustos." And the minute he said Sergeant Bustos, I just snapped right back into cop mode. I calmed down. I quit crying. I was like, was his video camera on? And what was the race of the suspect?
Right. Right.
Because in Austin, there had been so many shootings that were, righteous shootings, but the race became a factor and families were terrorized. Police families were terrorized over it. So I just went into logistics. Are we going to have to move? What do I need to do?
Right. And was it righteous? Was it the good? Yeah. And
it kind of snapped me back into reality when the officer said Sergeant Bustos, because then I'm like, oh, okay, I have to straighten up and fly right now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That pulls you back, your bootstraps back up and
then watching the aftermath of how the department handled it, how his chief of police handled it, professionally was very beneficial for me because we had no officer involved shooting policy at my department. We were a much smaller department and had never had an officer involved shooting. And so logistically watching all that happen was very helpful for my department. And I was able to go back and implement policies and things like that based on what I saw him go through and how his department did.
Right. You learn a lot. You can learn a lot. Is that the first and only shooting you've been in, Javi?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. First and only shooting that I've been involved in. And, even though it was a good shoot, I was cleared by the grand jury and everything. I can't imagine for the officers that are involved in multiple shootings, because I know what it took out of me. I know what it took out of my family. And for the repeated trauma like that, as far as the shooting goes, for an officer, if they have multiple ones, that's something that I would never want anyone to go through at all, because it's just a repeated trauma that happens over and over again.
Right. Yeah. I know a couple guys who have been in multiple, and it's just no fault of their own. They just happen to be at the right place, wrong time, whatever you want to say. And it's just one of those things that when it happens, and then they're able to share that information with other people, it's helpful, but you can only imagine the toll that it does take. And so now you said, Kathy, that the way that his department handled the whole thing was just professional. How was it? How did they take care of things?
Well, they had policies and procedures to begin with, so that was good. And his chief at the time was wonderful. Different people have different thought processes about his chief at the time, but he was very good to Javier. He got out right in front of the story. He reviewed Javier's video from the scene that night. He made a media statement right away, and he didn't clear him officially, but basically let the community know that it was a good shoot, that he only fired one shot, and that ultimately the suspect took his own life. And Javier is very humble about his shooting, but it was a long shot, and he hit him just right next to the spine. And so the medical examiner had to weigh homicide, suicide. And ultimately Javier's shot was lethal, but because he was able to shoot himself, he ruled it as suicide.
I see.
But the chief of police was wonderful. Everybody that we dealt with was wonderful. They knew they had peer support. They did a debriefing in an appropriate time frame. They had a psychologist that he saw and that we saw. They had to take his weapon, of course, but they gave him another one to replace it. They let his family and some of our friends be with him in the immediate hours after the shooting. I just can't, for Austin at the time, they just did a wonderful job. And as opposed to stories that we had heard of other officers from the same department who had been treated completely differently, but it was because of a different chief.
Right. And it's funny, we see those now. We'll see. I mean, every shooting is nitpicked on the news or wherever. And you see these, and you see some chiefs or sheriffs they're right on it. They're saying, hey, this is what happened, and we're going to review the video, and we're going to look at this objectively, but we're also going to, if our officer's in the wrong, we'll hold them accountable. And, more often than not, you see those guys come up there and say, this is what we're going to do. Then there's those ones that seem to be wanting to make political statements or, whatever, whether it's Chicago or where giant cities and stuff. And there's the poor officer is just hung out to dry, and they have no idea. They don't know what's coming next, and they don't know. I was trying to do my job to help somebody, and now all of a sudden I'm being ostracized. How does this work? Where does this?
Right.
Yeah, it's very tragic because we've seen many officers who were involved in as good a shoot as Javier's was, if you want to call it a good shoot. It was a justified shooting, and the chiefs, the administrators, whatever rank or title they have, just let the media run away with the story instead of coming out right up front and saying, these are the facts. a lot of administrators hide behind either no comment or it's under investigation, and the media just runs away with the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so tragic. And we see it over and over again. Basically 90% of the traumatic event is typically what an officer's department does to them versus the incident that they were involved in. And we were very fortunate that everybody from top to bottom handled Javier's shooting well. And we can't say that for everybody from Austin Police Department.
Right. Or we can't say that nationally, because we have peered so many officers and their spouses where they say, I have no problems that I had to shoot somebody. I have no problems that I had to kill somebody. My problem and my family's problem is how we were treated after the fact.
Right.
And we would hear, it's how my department or agency treated me.
What the media said.
What the
administrator said to the media.
But now we're hearing even more of not only is how my department treated me, but how my city government treated me.
Oh, right.
There's been so many instances where, like what we were just saying earlier about the political statements, where the city government either says nothing at all or basically crucifies the officer before they've had their day in court when it runs that course.
Right.
And they help create that horrible narrative against law enforcement that the media and the activists feed on.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that I had in my head when Javier was involved in his shooting was it wasn't even a controversial shooting. It was a justified shooting, but it was an officer that the city made it a racial event. And that officer was harassed. He was threatened. His children were threatened. They had to move. They had to change his children's school. So when Javier was involved in his shooting and they called me, that was all I could think of was, we're going to have to move now. And of course, our children were grown. Our daughter was in college and our son was in the Marine Corps. But, how is this going to affect them? And all of those things were running through my head. And that's part of the traumatic event of his shooting, was all these dynamics that happened to the family after.
Right. I was in one a while back, and my department, they did it as well. They did a stellar job. The chief got right out there. They obviously they have to be a little bit objective until they know, based off of what the district attorney finds and the investigators and all that stuff. However, once all that was said and done, there was support. There was support from the get-go. Like you said, they come in, they have people around you, make sure you're good. You get assigned a peer, you get all this different stuff, and you make sure your family's involved with it. But you go home and there's some downtime between the time when decisions are made and while they're looking at it. You'd like to think that I'm going to be good. Things are going to be fine. And I know what I did was right. And for some officers out there, that just hasn't been the case. They knew they did what was right, and yet still they get crucified. But there's that downtime. How was that downtime for you, Javi? When
okay,
you know what I mean?
It's interesting because the downtime for me was something that I was going through, where I was going through it in two mindsets. I was going through it as an officer who had just been involved in a shooting, but prior to me promoting to corporal, I was also a field training officer. Mm-hmm. So my mind was also kind of in a training mode, thinking I need to remember certain things. So if I ever have to train somebody or talk to somebody else who's been involved in a shooting, I know what to do or what to say. So it was this duality of my brain going on, that it was emotional and it was rational, kind of like what Kathy experienced. And her being peer support at the time, because she was already certified peer support. I wasn't. I was asking her certain questions as far as like, is it normal for me to be reacting this way? Or is it normal for me to be feeling this? And she was guiding me through it when I got home,
right,
as exhausted as I was.
Right.
Yeah. And we were fortunate in that, like Javier said, I was completing Leadership Command College in Huntsville. And so I was set to go back out of town on Sunday. His shooting happened early Saturday morning. Mm. And so I told him, either you come with me or I'm not going. And it was my last week and I was about to graduate. And so he came back with me. And because it was a leadership command college, there were about 30 police officers in the group and 7 shooters in my group.
Wow.
So we all stayed at Sam Houston State University Hotel, and he just went from room to room to room receiving peer support from all these officers that have been involved in shootings. So, from beginning to end, it was, I don't want to say a good experience because it was obviously not a good experience, but things went well on his behalf. He
beneficial experience.
Support. Yes. A beneficial experience.
Yeah.
So he went back with me that week, and, the guys from my classroom did an awesome job with him. And then, we had my graduation and came home, but so he didn't have the traditional downtime that most officers would have.
Right. Yeah. I remember, and I think I've talked about this before on here, but I had that time where afterwards, I think the next day, it's there's nothing, there's no knowledge of what's going to happen, and you don't know if you want to talk about it, but you try to find something that you can just sink into, so you don't have to deal with the world, or, you're not into, going and playing at the park, or maybe you go for a walk, but I know what I did was I just played video games for a day, and I never play video games. And my son still had his PlayStation here, and he's in the military now, but he's at the time he was in the military at that time too, but he had all his stuff here. So I was playing video games, and I never do it. And it took my mind completely out of it. So I didn't have to think about something, and this could go there. So
for me, it wasn't video games or anything like that, but literally Kathy shoved a copy of On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman in my hands and said, "Start reading," which is funny because she had seen Colonel Grossman speak multiple times throughout her career, and she had the book, and she would tell me, he's close, let's go watch him speak. And I was like, no, I was in the military, I don't need to see him speak. I know what he's going to say, blah, blah, blah. Didn't read the book, nothing like that whatsoever. So as she was driving me to Huntsville, Texas on that Sunday, I started reading On Killing, which was very beneficial because, you're going through all these thoughts and everything. And when you're reading facts and studies and what Colonel Grossman was writing about, that was helpful. And I mean, it was immediate from, I finished On Killing, I want to read On Combat.
Right.
And what I also did is I was going from book after book after book concerning officer-involved shootings.
Right.
And that was how I coped through it, reading the written word. We ended up going on a cruise so many months after my shooting. And I remember my friend was saying, why is Javier reading this book about shooting and killing and everything? But that was my way of coping.
Right.
That was my self-therapeutic ways of getting through the incident, was reading as much as I could to learn about everything I could.
Right. And that's the benefit of having a spouse that gets it. My wife, she grew up in both parents were in the military. And so she'd been all over the place. And so her mom got called back on 9/11 and all this different stuff. And she would, she let me have that one day to decompress, whatever. And then after that, she said, no, what are you going to do? We got stuff to do. And so she would make sure that I'm doing something. And she, what are you reading? What are you watching? Wanted to make sure that I wasn't, just filling my head with stupid stuff. And so, there's that benefit of putting good stuff into your head. So you have a way to cope, to understand where you're going to go.
Right.
Yeah. And I think at the time, because both of us, I was in training at my department and Javier was a field training officer. Both of us never thought of it like, what is the emotional toll on us that this is taking? We thought of it as, what can we teach other people about this experience? And so we immediately went into the educational aspect of it. I had him up in front of the classroom teaching, probably way before he should have, because the grand jury and all of that.
Right.
But in our arrogance, and I openly say that at the time, but in our arrogance at the time, we thought, what can we do for other people out of this experience versus what do we need to do for ourselves out of this experience.
Right. We totally ignored ourselves. And like Kathy said, she had a line of duty death a month before my shooting. We totally ignored how it affected our daughter, and even ignored how it affected our son, even though he was in the Marine Corps. We just ignored our humanity
as a family,
which is a huge mistake. And part of what we do when we do our presentations is we talk about don't forget yourselves and don't forget how it affects your family.
So how did it affect your family? Were there things that just, you look back and you're like, we are not going there again, and you know, and now you're able to use that in your presentations and stuff, or, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I think you saw part of it in the training that we were in Las Vegas, that Patrick Shaver put together a clip for us with just a little snippet of us talking about how we love to help other people. Well, when that video was, when Patrick was interviewing us, our marriage was in crisis. We were not going to survive as a couple very much longer. We were almost headed for a divorce. We were both individually in crisis and as a couple in crisis. And so when we look back at that video, or the clip of that video, we just laugh at the arrogance that we felt at that time of, we're going to be out helping other people. You know, this is a good experience because we can help so many officers, and not even taking into account what we were going through. And not just as a result of his shooting, but we had lost Leonard Reed in the line of duty death. And 2 years prior to that, my corporal had attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head with a shotgun. So I had 17 years of critical incidents. He had, like 10 years of critical incidents.
Plus my critical incidents. I was in Operation Restore Hope in Mogadishu, Somalia.
Oh, okay.
And so
the whole time we're telling each other, we're fine. What can we do for other people?
Right.
And I think that's how public servants get caught up in this whole mindset of, we're here to help everybody else and not ourselves. And so we were in personal crisis at the time of that video. And, but that video was a window into our kind of hammer on the head that we needed help.
Right.
And so that video began our journey towards getting the help that we needed.
Just when it was getting good. Keep an eye out for part 2 of episode 38 of the What's a Hero podcast with me, Ken Frownfelter, where we will continue our conversation with Kathy and Javier Bustos, and we're going to get into more about who it is and who they are and what they did to become that peer couple. In the meantime, check out the What's a Hero podcast on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also go to the website, the What's a Hero podcast.buzzsprout.com. We have all of our previous episodes. Additionally, we have links that'll take you to whatever podcast platform you like to listen to the show on that you might want to download it on. It'll take you there, whether it's Apple Podcast or Stitcher or whoever you're listening to it on. Right, Spotify, I don't know. And you'll go there. You can subscribe to it. You'll get a notification when the new episode drops, when every new episode drops. And if you download, that gives me some numbers to know who's listening, where you guys listening from, all that good stuff. And it kind of helps me out. So until then, you try to stay cool and stay who you are, and know that there are people out there that have it rough, but they still want to do things for other people, and that you are loved and that you are cared about no matter who you are. Even if you don't think you are, you are. There is we'll talk about this in part 2, but there is a phone number for police officers that Kathy and Javier will talk about, and it's 1-800-COP-LINE. If you need to talk, if you're struggling, if you need a peer, these guys will talk to you. And it's not just Kathy and Javier on this 1-800-COP-LINE. It's other police officers, it's retired police officers, it's people that know who you are, not know specifically personally, but they know who you are as a police officer, and they know how to be there to help and just come alongside you and help out. So 1-800-COP-LINE and hashtag #JustOneContact. We'll get into more on that one in part 2. So until then, for Kathy and Javier Bustos, I have been Ken Frownfelter, and this has been the What's a Hero podcast. We are clear.